32 floors above a frozen city, one window still burns red in the dark. Snow hammers the glass. Inside that light, a man is weeping, not softly. The kind of weeping a powerful man does only when he believes no one alive can hear him. When everything he built is dying on the screens in front of him, one number at a time. Down the long hallway, a cleaning cart rolls, no sound. The wheels have been oiled by careful hands. An old man pushes it, grey beard, bent shoulders. A faded canvas bag over one arm. 11 years, and no one in this tower has ever truly looked at him. He hears the weeping. He stops. Then underneath it another sound. Thin, sharp, rhythmic, 3 short tones, a pause, 3 again. And the old man goes very still, because he knows that sound. He spent 2 years of his life learning exactly what it means. And it does not mean the market is failing.
The freezing winds off Lake Michigan clawed at the reinforced glass of the 32nd floor, as if the storm itself had climbed all that way just to watch what was about to happen. It was almost midnight. The Meridian Tower stood like a frozen monument over the sleeping financial district of Chicago, most of its windows dark, only a scattered handful still glowing against the snow. Down on the street, the city had surrendered to the cold hours ago. The plows had given up. The taxis had thinned to nothing. The few souls still out there moved fast in bent-shouldered collars, up, heads down, hurrying toward whatever warmth was waiting for them. Up here near the top, where fortunes were built with a whisper and erased with a keystroke, one stubborn light still burned in the corner office. And down the long, carpeted hallway, an old man pushed a cleaning cart. His name was Sutton Harrow. He was 71 years old. His beard had gone the color of wood smoke, and winter ash trimmed close along a jaw that had once been sharp and was now softened by decades. He moved with the slow, deliberate quiet of a man who had learned long ago how to make himself disappear. His hands were broad and steady, the knuckles thickened by years, and they rested on the handle of the cart the way another man's hands might rest on the wheel of a car he had driven for 40 years. Without thought, without effort, as if the thing were simply an extension of his body. The wheels of his cart turned without a sound. He had oiled them himself. The other men on the night crew let theirs squeal and rattle through the halls, announcing their arrival to empty rooms, and they laughed about it, and they did not care. But Sutton preferred silence. Silence was the only thing in this building that had ever belonged to him. Slung over his shoulder was a faded canvas bag. Inside it, a thermos of tea sweetened with honey, the way his wife had made it for him a lifetime ago. A bruised apple he would eat near dawn. And a thick, dark blue hardcover book, its spine cracked from 1,000 openings, its pages crowded edge to edge with handwritten equations in a small, precise hand. That book did not belong on a cleaning cart. It did not belong on the night crew. If any of the young analysts who ruled this floor by day had ever opened it, the breath would have left their bodies. But none of them ever would, because the rule of the 32nd floor was simple and absolute. The old man with the cart was invisible. He was a ghost who wiped away their fingerprints and emptied their trash and vanished before the sun came up. They did not see him. They had never seen him. When they passed him in the hall, their eyes slid over him the way eyes slide over a potted plant. A light switch, a fire extinguisher bolted to the wall. He was furniture. He was part of the building, and Sutton Harrow had spent 11 years making certain it stayed that way. There was a kind of safety in being unseen. He had discovered that slowly over the long years, the way a man discovers the comforts of a small room he never meant to live in. When no one looked at you, no one asked questions. No one wanted to know what you had been or what you had lost, or why a man with hands like a scholar's was pushing a mop at midnight. Invisibility was a coat he had grown to wear. It was heavy and it was gray and it kept out the cold. He paused at the corner where the hallway turned toward the executive suites. A voice crackled over the small radio clipped to his apron. "Sutton." It was Marlene, the night supervisor, her voice dry and tired and threaded through with static. "The corner office. Mr. Ashford's still in there. Been in there alone almost half an hour, asked nobody disturb him. You wait till he leaves, or you go in quiet, do the minimum, and you get out. No talking. You hear me?" Sutton pressed the button. "Heard," he said. One word. He had learned a long time ago that silence cost the soul far less than the hollow little pleasantries men were forced to trade in places like this. A nod did the work of a paragraph. A single word did the work of a nod. He let go of the radio and stood a moment in the dim corridor listening to the building breathe. The hum of the heating, the faint groan of steel flexing against the wind, the deep, almost inaudible shudder that ran through the tower's bones when a gust came hard off the lake. Sounds he knew the way other men knew the sound of their own families moving through a house. He had spent more nights in this building over the last 11 years than he had spent anywhere else in his life. It was in its cold and impersonal way the closest thing he had to a home. Then he began his work. He started in the glass-walled conference rooms, wiping down the long tables, gathering the abandoned coffee cups, emptying the bins that overflowed with crumpled paper. He worked the way he always worked, methodically, room by room, leaving each one a little better than he had found it. There was a small and private pride in that. No one would ever notice the gleam he left on a table, the way he squared the chairs, the care he took with the corners. But he would notice. He had decided a long time ago that if a thing was worth doing at all, it was worth doing as if someone were watching, even when no one ever was. His father had taught him that the same as he had taught him everything. He never tried to read what crossed his hands. He had trained himself not to. But the eye does what the eye was built to do, and Sutton's eye had been built decades ago to see the bones beneath the skin of a number. A quarterly balance, a risk exposure matrix, a column of figures that should have balanced and did not. His gaze caught these things in the space of a heartbeat, the way another man might catch a familiar face in a crowd, and then he looked away and kept working. There was no use in seeing. Seeing was a habit he had tried and failed for 11 years to break. It was like having perfect pitch in a world full of music you were no longer allowed to play. Every off note made you flinch. Every error on a discarded page snagged at the back of his mind like a thorn, and he had to make himself let it go again and again, night after night. Because once before the world cracked open and swallowed the life he was supposed to have, Sutton Harrow had been a different man. He had studied advanced risk modeling and algorithmic anomaly detection at one of the finest universities on the East Coast, back when the whole world had felt like an open map with no edges. He had worked the quantitative trading desk of an institution whose name still made younger men sit up straighter when they heard it. He had been young and brilliant and certain that mathematics was a door that opened onto every room worth entering. He could remember dimly the feeling of walking into a room full of the smartest people in the country and knowing without arrogance, simply as a fact, that he could see things none of them could see. The shape of a risk before it formed, the crack in a model before it broke, the lie buried in a column of honest-looking numbers. His father had put a slide rule in his hands before he could ride a bicycle. Cornelius Harrow, professor of applied mathematics, a tall, stern man who smelled of chalk and pipe tobacco, who had taught his only son that numbers were the one language on earth that could not lie. People lie, his father used to say, leaning down over a kitchen table covered in scratch paper, the lamplight catching the gray in his beard. Markets lie. Men lie to themselves most of all. But the numbers, Sutton, the numbers, never learned how. You listen to them when they're quiet, and you listen harder when they scream, and they will always, always tell you the truth. That boy was gone now, folded up and put away in the deepest drawer of an old man's heart, packed in beside a photograph worn soft at the corners, the photograph of a son, Thomas. Sutton's hands slowed on the edge of the table. He let himself think the name only rarely the way a man rations water in a desert. Thomas had been 7 years old when the doctors first said the word that changed everything. 7 years old, with his father's quick mind and his mother's laugh and a sickness growing quietly inside him that no amount of brilliance could outsmart. Sutton could still see him at that age, small and bright and endlessly curious, sitting at the same kitchen table where Cornelius had once sat with Sutton, asking why and why and why again, until the questions ran out past the edge of what anyone knew. Sutton's wife had not survived the years that followed. The grief took her first slowly the way a long winter takes a garden, and then the long road took everything else. He had sold the house. He had liquidated every account, cashed out, every position walked away from the desk, and the title, and the future, all of it, without once looking back. Because there was a boy in a hospital bed who needed his father's hand, and a stack of bills that grew taller every single month, and a man could not be a legend and a father both. Not in the years that mattered. Not in the years a child needed him most. He had sat in waiting rooms with that blue book open on his knee, reading equations under fluorescent light at 3 in the morning, not because they would save anyone, but because they were the only thing that kept his mind from breaking apart in his hands. The mathematics was a wall he built against the fear. As long as he was solving, he was not screaming. As long as his mind was moving through the clean and ordered country of numbers, it was not trapped in the small, terrible room of a father watching his son fight for breath. Thomas had fought. God, how the boy had fought. There were years when it seemed the worst was behind them. There were birthdays and small triumphs and ordinary afternoons that Sutton had learned to treasure with a desperate secret intensity because he understood as Thomas in his youth could not how few of them there might be. And for a while, a long while, it seemed he might win. But the years took him anyway in the end. They took the boy and left behind one small, fierce thing in his place. A granddaughter, Della. She had been 3 when her father died, too young to remember much of him, and Sutton had made it his work, his calling, his whole reason for going on to make sure she would have everything Thomas would have wanted for her. She was 24 now, in her final year of medical school across the city, learning to do the one thing her father's illness had taught her family to need. She did not know what her grandfather had been. She knew only that he was kind and quiet and that he worked nights at an office building downtown so she could keep her books and her tiny apartment and her dream. He had let her believe the work was nothing, a loving lie told to shield her from the weight of what he had laid down so that she could stand. Now he was an old man with no resume, no contacts, no network left alive that remembered his name. The men he had once worked beside were retired or dead, or so high up in the world now that they would never take a call from a number they did not recognize. Too tired to climb back up from the bottom of a mountain he had already climbed once before in another life with another body. So he had taken the cart. It paid the last of the medical debt. It let him read at dawn. It was honest and it was quiet, and it asked nothing of him but his invisibility. He straightened, pressing a hand to the small of his back, and rounded the corner toward the corner suite of Ashford Vane Capital. And he stopped. The heavy mahogany door stood ajar. Light spilled out into the hallway, but it was wrong. Not the cold, sterile white of the ceiling fixtures. This light was alive. It pulsed. It flickered red, and then redder, throwing jagged, moving shadows across the carpet, painting the dark hall in the color of a wound. It was the light of trading monitors, many of them, all flashing at once, and from inside that bleeding glow came a sound that stopped the blood in Sutton's veins. A man was weeping. Not the soft grief of a funeral, not the quiet leaking of a man who has had bad news. This was something worse. The strangled, swallowed, ashamed weeping of a grown man who had held it in for far too long and could hold it no more. The sound of a man watching something he loved die in front of him and being able to do nothing at all. Sutton knew that sound. He had made that sound himself once in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning with no one to hear him. It was a sound that came from a place beneath dignity, beneath pride, beneath everything a man builds to keep himself standing. It was the sound of the floor giving way. Sutton's hands tightened on the cart's plastic handle. The smart thing was to back away, to skip the corner office tonight, to let the wreckage sit until morning, until the daylight crew could clean it up after the man's misery had been carried out the door. He had survived 11 years on this floor by knowing exactly when to disappear, exactly when a closed door meant a closed door, exactly when not to be seen. This was one of those times. Every instinct he had was telling him to turn the cart around and be a ghost the way he had taught himself to be. He took a single step backward, and then the broken voice spoke again, low and ruined, barely a whisper, repeating the same words over and over like a prayer that had stopped working. Everything. It's all gone. I don't understand. How is this even possible? Sutton swallowed hard, his heart hammered against his ribs. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself the man's money was the man's own affair, and a ghost did not speak, and an invisible thing did not intrude on the private ruin of the men who ruled the day. These men with their towers and their fortunes were not his people. They had never once seen him. Why should he risk the one safe, quiet thing he had left to step into the catastrophe of a stranger who would not have known his name if his life depended on it? And then he heard it, a sound underneath the weeping, a sound the crying man was too broken to even notice. It came from one of the monitors, thin and sharp and rhythmic, almost lost beneath the man's grief, but unmistakable to an ear that had been trained decades ago to hear exactly such things. 3 short tones, a pause. 3 short tones again. Sutton went very still. He knew that sound. He knew it the way a man knows the cry of his own child in a crowded room. He had not heard it in over a decade, but it lived in him, still buried but never dead, because he had spent 2 years of his young life writing about exactly what it meant. It had been the subject of his thesis, the thing that had made his name in the small and rarefied world where such names were made. He had sat in a windowless lab through 100 nights listening to systems sing their warnings, learning the difference between the 10,000 ordinary alarms a machine could raise and the one specific pattern that meant something else entirely. 3 short tones, a pause, 3 again. It was the signature of a system being breached from the inside. It was the sound an engine made when its own parameters were being rewritten by a hand that did not belong, when the rules a machine lived by were being quietly edited by someone who had the keys. It was not the noise of a market failing. A market failing made a different sound, a chaotic and honest sound. The sound of 10,000 frightened people all selling at once. This was nothing like that. This was the noise of a machine being robbed by someone who knew precisely where it was weakest. Someone patient, someone who had been planning for a very long time. It was the sound of a mathematical crime in progress right now on the other side of that door. And Sutton Harrow, 71 years old ghost of the night crew, discovered in that instant that there was one thing in this building he could not do. He could not walk away. It was not a decision exactly. It was something older than a decision. It was the thing his father had built into him at the kitchen table, the thing that had survived everything else being burned away. When the numbers scream, a man must speak. The boy his father had made was still in there, under the gray coat of invisibility, under 11 years of careful silence, and the boy stood up. He pushed the door open and went in. The office was cavernous and dark, lit only by the 3 enormous monitors that lined the far wall, and the man sitting collapsed behind a massive desk of black glass. His name was Roland Ashford, founder and chief executive of the firm, whose name was etched in steel beside the elevators. And he looked in that moment like a man at the bottom of a sea. The wealth of the room only made it worse. The original art on the walls, the rare wood, the leather, the view that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, all of it stood in cold and useless witness to a man coming apart at the center of it. His tie hung loose. His cuffs were unbuttoned and pushed back. His hands pressed hard against his temples as though he were trying to keep his own skull from coming apart. He barely registered the soft click of the door, the slow arrival of the old man in his cart. To him it was only a shadow, a piece of furniture that moved. The cleaning man come to empty the trash while the world ended. "Just clean," Roland rasped, not looking up, his eyes locked on the cascading red graphs that were even now vaporizing 20 years of his life. "Clean and go." Sutton said nothing. He took out his cloth. He began slowly to wipe the gleaming edge of the great glass desk the way he had wiped 10,000 surfaces in this building over 11 silent years. His hands moved like a working man's hands, easy and unhurried, drawing no attention to themselves. But his eyes were doing something else entirely. They climbed the cascade of data on the central screen, and in the space of 3 seconds they read it. Not the way the analysts read it with their dashboards and their alerts and their 4 hours of frantic, useless troubleshooting. Sutton read it the way his father had taught him to read it all those years ago at the kitchen table. He read the bones underneath. He did not look at what the numbers were doing. He looked at how they were doing it. He looked at the rhythm, the shape, the grain of the thing, the way a master carpenter looks not at a chair, but at the joints that hold it together. And what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There, threaded through the chaos, was a fingerprint, the unmistakable signature of ghost executions, draining the fund's positions in bursts so small and so fast that no human eye was meant to catch them. Capital bleeding out a drop at a time, faster than thought, hidden inside the ordinary churn of the market, like a thief moving through a crowd taking a wallet. Here, a watch, there. Never enough at once to make anyone cry out. And the pattern of it was wrong. It did not match a market collapse. It did not match any panic, any geopolitical shock, any sector-wide sell-off. There was no outside force doing this. Sutton had lived through real collapses. He knew their texture. They were ugly and ragged and human, full of the fear of 1,000 traders, all running for the same door. This was nothing like that. The losses lined up too perfectly, repeated too cleanly, marched in a rhythm too precise, to be born of any free and chaotic market. The market does not keep time. This kept time. This was a loop, a sequence, something built by hands hidden inside the machine designed to drain the funds slowly while wearing the mask of bad luck. This weeping man was not being ruined by the market. He was being murdered from the inside, by someone he trusted, someone with a key. Sutton straightened up. He gripped the cleaning cloth against his apron, and for the first time in over a decade, he heard his father's voice rise up clear and certain inside his chest. The voice that had put a slide rule in a small boy's hands and told him the truth about the world. When the numbers scream, his father said a man must speak. Sutton drew a slow, fortifying breath. He set his hand flat on the cold edge of the glass desk, and in a voice that was quiet but carried the weight of a thing he had buried for 11 years, he spoke. "That isn't the market," he said. "Your screens aren't showing you a failure." The silence that fell on the office was heavier than any scream of panic could have been. It pressed down on the room, swallowing the low hum of the tower, the whisper of the wind against the glass. Roland Ashford stopped breathing. Slowly, his hands came down from his face. He turned. He stared at the old man in the cleaning apron, this gray-bearded shape that had drifted in out of the dark to empty his trash, and his exhausted, ruined mind fought to understand a thing that did not fit anywhere in the world he knew. The invisible man, the ghost with the cart, had just said in one clean sentence the thing that he and his team of brilliant, panic-stricken analysts had failed to see across 4 hours of agony. "What?" Roland said. His voice cracked on the single word. He leaned forward in his great leather chair, peering through the red gloom, as if he might be looking at a hallucination, a thing his broken mind had conjured up out of grief. "What did you just say to me?" Sutton's pulse roared in his ears. 11 years of careful silence stood up inside him and begged him to apologize, to step back, to mutter an excuse, and flee back to the safety of his cart and his quiet and his beautiful invisibility. It would be so easy. He could say he was confused. He could say he didn't know what he'd meant. He could pull the gray coat back over himself and vanish, and by morning this would be nothing but a strange dream the man had had on the worst night of his life. But the man his father had made would not go back into the dark. He held Roland's gaze. He did not flinch. He lifted one weathered hand and pointed steady at the right-hand column of the central monitor, at the execution intervals logged there down to the millisecond. "Real trades breathe," Sutton said. "High frequency or not, they have a chaos to them, a natural variation. The market is millions of people and machines all deciding things at once, and that makes a kind of noise or roughness you can feel it if you know how to look. Look at yours." He moved his finger down the column. "Every 43rd operation breaks from your own logic. Exactly the 43rd. Every time." Roland's eyes followed the old man's hand. "Numbers don't fall into a pattern that clean on their own," Sutton said quietly. "Not in a free market. A rhythm like that doesn't grow. It gets built. By a person. By hands." He let the words settle. "Somebody is inside your engine, Mr. Ashford. And if you don't shut it down right now, there won't be anything left of you by morning." For a long moment, Roland did not move. Then he turned slowly toward the screens, and he leaned in close, inches from the glass, and he looked at the thing the old man had shown him. He was a clever man, whatever else he was. He had built this firm with his own mind, and the mind was still in there beneath the grief, and now given one true thing to grip, it began to climb back out of the pit. He did not look at it like a victim anymore. He looked at it like a man who had just realized he was being robbed. 30 seconds stretched out into something that felt like an hour. Roland traced the sequence with his eyes, the 43rd and the 43rd again, and the 43rd after that, and somewhere in those 30 seconds, the grief drained out of his face, and something colder and harder took its place. Because he was seeing it now. He was seeing the parasite disguised inside his own architecture patient as a spider waiting for this exact night to strike. His hands moved to the keyboard. They were shaking, but they did not hesitate. He hammered out a fast sequence of override commands and then a long master password that no one else on Earth was ever meant to know. And he hit the key that severed the engine from the exchanges entirely. The monitors flickered. Once, twice, and then the cascading red went still. The aggressive bleeding warnings froze in place and faded into the dull gray of dormant software. The room fell into a deep and ringing silence, the silence of a wound finally closed, and the red light that had painted the office the color of catastrophe simply died. Roland Ashford collapsed back into his chair. He shut his eyes. A wave of nausea and relief broke over him so hard that for a moment he could not speak at all, only sit there in the dark and breathe, understanding slowly that this anonymous old man with the cart had just reached into the fire and pulled out the better part of his life's work. When he opened his eyes again, he looked at Sutton with an expression that had nothing of the executive left in it. No command, no distance, only a raw and naked wonder. "Your name," he said softly. "Please tell me your name." He swallowed. "And tell me how in God's name a man cleaning my office at midnight knows what a senior quant engineer spends his whole career trying to learn." Sutton lowered his gaze for a moment. He felt the weight of 11 silent years rising in his throat like a river finally cresting over a dam that had held it back too long. There was a danger in this moment that the man across the desk could not see. To say his name, to claim what he had been, was to crack open the gray coat that had kept him safe. It was to be seen. And being seen was the one thing he had taught himself with great and patient effort never to allow. "Sutton," he said. "Sutton Harrow." He looked at the old blue book waiting in the canvas bag on his cart. Its spine cracked, its margins crowded with a younger man's certainty. "And there was a time," he said quietly, "when knowing that was the only thing I was good for." Outside, the storm threw itself against the glass, and far below the city slept on, unaware that on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Tower, a ghost had just spoken, and an old life buried under a decade of silence had begun slowly to stir. Because Roland Ashford was already staring at the gray-bearded man in front of him with a question forming behind his exhausted eyes. A question that had nothing to do with cleaning and everything to do with the one terrible fact the old man's discovery had left hanging in the dark. If someone had built this from the inside, then someone had a key, and there was only one other man alive who had ever held one. The question hung in the dark office like smoke that would not clear. Roland Ashford rose slowly from his chair. He crossed to the floor-to-ceiling windows and stood with his back to the old man, staring out at the glittering carcass of the sleeping city, and Sutton watched the executive's shoulders draw up tight as the truth began to assemble itself behind his eyes. There is a particular stillness that comes over a man in the moment before he says aloud a thing he cannot unsay. Sutton had seen it before in another life. He saw it now. "You said someone built this," Roland murmured. "From the inside." "I did. That means access." Roland's voice had gone flat and strange, the voice of a man reading his own sentence off a page. "Not a hacker, not some outside hand reaching in through a firewall. To write a loop that lives inside the core architecture, to disguise it as my own logic so well that it fooled my whole team for 4 hours. A man would need the keys, the real keys. He would have to know where every door is, because he helped hang every door." He turned around. The red glow was gone now, and in the pale wash of a single desk lamp, his face had aged 10 years. "There is only one other person on this earth who has those keys," Roland said. Sutton said nothing. He had learned over a long life that some truths a man has to walk toward alone, and the kindest thing another man can do is stand quiet and let him arrive. To rush a man to a grief like this was to rob him of the only dignity left to him, which was the dignity of saying it himself. "His name is Garrick Wexler," Roland said, and the name came out of him like something torn loose, like a splinter pulled from deep in the flesh. "My partner. We founded this firm together. 20 years. He laughed, a short, ugly sound with no humor in it at all. 20 years. He wrote half the original engine with his own hands. We slept on the floor of a rented office the first year, 2 desks and a coffee machine, and a dream too big for either of us to carry alone. He stood next to me at my father's funeral. He held my arm at the grave so I wouldn't fall." The name settled into the chilled air of the office like a sentence handed down. Sutton understood in that moment that the money was not the wound. He had seen it on men before in another life. The dollars could be counted and grieved and sometimes recovered. A fortune was a thing made of paper and electricity, and paper and electricity could be rebuilt. But the betrayal of a friend of 20 years was a different kind of theft. It reached into a place where no insurance could follow. It took something that could never be returned because the thing it took was not in the present at all. It was in the past. It reached back through 2 decades and poisoned every good memory turned every shared triumph into a lie, made a man wonder whether any of it, any single moment of it, had been real. Roland leaned hard against the glass. For a moment, the founder of Ashford Vane Capital looked like he might simply slide down it to the floor. He knew, Roland whispered. He knew I'd be alone tonight. I told him myself. I told him I wanted the building to myself, that I'd be staying late to think through the quarter. I handed him the night. He knew exactly when I'd be vulnerable, and he chose tonight, and he sat somewhere out in that city in his warm house with his good scotch, and he watched the numbers bleed me out, and he waited. He waited for me to break. Then something changed in him. Sutton watched it happen. The grief did not leave, but it hardened around an edge the way water hardens around a stone. The man was finding the bottom of the pit, and there was rock down there, and he was beginning to stand on it. Roland straightened. He turned to the old man. "Mr. Harrow," he said. "Sutton, I'm going to ask you something I have no right to ask." Sutton waited. "Stay," Roland said. "Stay until dawn. Help me find every footprint this man left in my system. I cannot face him with a broken heart and a feeling in my gut. He is the most persuasive man I have ever known. If I walk into a room with him, and only my suspicion he will talk his way out of it, and worse, he will make me doubt my own eyes, the way he has made me doubt them for months, without my even knowing. I have to face him with proof, mathematically perfect, undeniable proof, the kind a man cannot talk his way out of, the kind that does not care how persuasive he is. And I cannot do it alone because I do not see the way you see." His voice dropped low and humble, a sound Sutton suspected very few people had ever heard from this man. "4 hours my whole team and I stared at this and saw nothing. You walked in and saw everything in 3 seconds. I am asking you to stay." Sutton felt the fear move through him, then slow and cold, coiling up from somewhere deep. He understood what was being asked. To say yes was to step across a line and never come back. The ghost would have to put down the cart. The invisible man would have to let himself be seen fully, completely, in a way he had not allowed in 11 years. There would be lawyers. There would perhaps be courts. There would be his name, his real name, spoken aloud in rooms full of powerful people. Everything he had built, the careful safe, nothing of his quiet life, would end the moment he opened his mouth and chose to help. The gray coat would come off, and it would not go back on. He thought of Della, 24 years old, bent over a textbook in a tiny apartment across the city, learning to mend the kind of damage that had once been done to her own family. He thought of how she had never once complained about the second-hand coats, the careful budgets, the grandfather who came home smelling of disinfectant at dawn. He thought of how she had grown up watching him push a cart and had somehow, out of that, learned that work was honorable and that no honest labor was beneath a person's dignity. He thought of her courage, which she had never known she'd inherited, and where it had come from. And he thought with a sudden clarity that surprised him of what it would mean for her someday to know that her grandfather had not only swept floors, but had once, when it mattered, stood up out of the shadows and done a hard and frightening thing because it was right. When the numbers screamed, his father said a man must speak. Sutton nodded. "I'll stay," he said. Roland closed his eyes for a moment, and something in his face loosened just slightly, like a man who has found one solid thing to stand on in a flood. He picked up the internal phone and dialed the security desk in the lobby 32 floors below. The man who answered was Mordecai Vane, the old night porter the whole building called Kai, who had worked the door of the Meridian since the day it opened and had seen 10,000 men come and go through that lobby believing themselves important. "Kai," Roland said, "I have an emergency up here, the kind I can't explain on the phone." He glanced at Sutton. "Mr. Harrow from the night crew is going to be assisting me through the rest of the night. I'm taking full responsibility for his time. I need you to let Marlene know quietly. No fuss. And Kay, this stays between us until I say otherwise. No one comes up to this floor without my word. No one." There was a pause on the line. Then Kai's voice came back low and certain, and Sutton, standing close, heard every word. "Mr. Ashford," the old porter said, "I have watched that man carry a blue book through my lobby for 11 years. I always told myself there was more to him than a cart, more than this building ever bothered to look at. You take care of him up there. Whatever you're facing, son, you found the right man to face it with." Roland set the phone down slowly. He looked at Sutton with something close to wonder. "He says he always knew," Roland murmured. "Kai. He says he always knew there was a brilliant man pushing a cart through his building. He shook his head and a strange, rueful smile touched his exhausted mouth. It took an old porter at a security desk to see it, and it took me 11 years and the worst night of my life to open my eyes. He pulled a second chair to the desk. Sit, he said, please, and tell me how to catch him. And so as the storm raged on against the windows and the city slept below the betrayed founder, and the invisible old man sat down side by side before the frozen screens and went hunting. What followed was a kind of work Sutton had not done in over a decade, and the moment his hands touched the keyboard, he understood that some things do not leave a man. They wait. They sleep, but they do not die. The years fell away. The cart, the apron, the gray coat of invisibility, all of it receded, and beneath it was the man he had been at 30. The man who could see the shape of a risk before it formed the man his father had built one equation at a time, at a kitchen table long ago. Roland was the fast one, the operator, his fingers flying across the keys, pulling up logs and cross-referencing accounts, and chasing down the threads that Sutton pointed him toward. He knew his own system in his bones, every command, every shortcut, and he moved through it at the speed of thought. But it was Sutton who was the architect. It was Sutton who sat back in the leather chair with his gray beard catching the lamplight, and his old eyes moving slow and certain across the data, and said, there, pull that one, and there, isolate that, and now show me the 43rd again, only further back. Roland was the hands. Sutton was the eyes. Together they were something neither could be alone. They peeled the thing apart layer by layer. The 43rd execution Sutton showed him was disguised behind a false identification hash. It wore the costume of a legitimate internal transfer, an ordinary movement of capital from one ledger to another, the kind of thing that flowed through the firm 10,000 times a day without anyone glancing at it twice. But underneath the costume, a sliver of the fun was being skimmed away, each time a fraction so small, no single transaction would ever raise an alarm, and routed out through a hidden external protocol to somewhere far away, somewhere that would take a forensic accountant months to even begin to trace. Look at the craftsmanship, Sutton said quietly, almost to himself. He leaned close to the screen, and for a moment Roland saw the professor's son in him, the man who had once read algorithms the way other men read poetry. Whoever wrote this is good, genuinely good. The overall shape of it, the aesthetic, it mimics your own style almost perfectly. The naming, the structure, the way the logic flows. He studied you. He learned to write like you so the thing would hide in plain sight, so that anyone who found it would assume it was yours, a piece of your own architecture they simply hadn't understood yet. He paused, his finger hovered over a single line of syntax. But here, he said, here the mask slips. The internal logic is sloppy, lazy even. There's a shortcut taken that no careful man would take, a corner cut that saves 5 minutes and risks everything. The man who built the disguise was careful, patient, brilliant. The man who wrote what's underneath had grown arrogant. He stopped trying. He thought no one would ever look this deep because no one ever had. Roland stared at the line for a long moment. That's Garrick, he said hollowly. That's exactly Garrick. He was our lead programmer in the early years before he moved up to managing partner, before he decided the code was beneath him. He knows every blind spot in this system because we built it together, the two of us side by side 20 years ago, on no sleep and too much coffee. His jaw tightened. And you're right. He got lazy. He always did when he thought he'd already won. He got proud. He cut corners. And there it is. His fingerprints in his own sloppiness, the one habit he never could break. That was the first thing they found. The second thing was worse. Tracing the pattern backward through the logs deeper and deeper into the firm's history, Sutton realized that this was not new. The fund had been bleeding for months, not in great gushing wounds, but in tiny, patient, invisible drops, drained out a fraction at a time, hidden so well that not one standard audit had ever caught it. It had been going on under everyone's eyes since long before tonight. Month after month, quarter after quarter, a slow and steady theft, so disciplined, so restrained, that it had hidden inside the firm's ordinary success like a tumor inside a healthy-looking body. And tonight was only the end of it. Tonight was the moment Garrick Wexler had finally decided to stop being patient. Why now? Roland whispered, staring at the months of slow theft laid bare on the screen. If he was getting away with it slow, if no one had caught it in all that time, why open the wound up all the way tonight? Why risk it all on one single night? Sutton did not answer right away. He sat back, he closed his eyes, and in the dark behind them, the old machine of his mind, the one that had been gathering dust under 11 years of disinfectant and silence, began to turn. It was a particular pleasure, almost a forgotten one, the feeling of a hard problem yielding to patient thought. He had not let himself feel it in a long time. It had seemed somehow disloyal to the life he was living to enjoy the thing he had given up. "He's not trying to steal it all," Sutton said slowly. "Not tonight. He could never move that much money fast enough, and he's far too smart to try. A man doesn't spend months being this careful only to grab the whole pot on the last night and run." He opened his eyes. "No, he's trying to make it look like the firm is collapsing. He wants the losses to be loud, catastrophic, public. He wants your board to wake up tomorrow to a smoking ruin." Roland went very still. "Why?" he breathed. "Because a man who steals quietly wants you not to notice," Sutton said. "That's the whole point of stealing quietly. But a man who suddenly makes it look like the ship is sinking all at once in a single night wants something else entirely. He doesn't want the money on the table. He wants the panic. He wants your board so frightened of going down with the firm that they'll grab the first hand that reaches out to save them. He wants them desperate. Desperate men sign anything." Roland's face had gone the color of ash. "The buyout," he said. "The buyout. There's an offer." Roland said, his voice tight and rising, the pieces snapping together now one after another. "An international investment group. They've been circling for months longer than I realized. I see that now. And Garrick has been pushing me to take it harder every week. A hostile buyout dressed up as a friendly rescue, a wolf in a shepherd's coat. I rejected them 3 times. I rejected them 3 separate times in the last quarter because I knew in my gut they only wanted to strip this place for parts, sell off the pieces, lay off the people, and walk away rich." He pressed a hand to his mouth and his eyes were wide and sick. "My God, he's working for them. He's been working for them the whole time. He's burning my company down to the ground so that when the smoke clears, the board will beg to hand it over to the very men he's already made his deal with. He doesn't want to rob me. He wants to deliver me." The two of them sat there in the lamplight, the founder and the ghost, and let the full shape of it settle over the room. It was not a theft. It was an execution. A betrayal 20 years in the making, planned to the millisecond, aimed with terrible precision at the heart of everything Roland Ashford had built. And it had been on the very edge of working. If Sutton had turned his cart around in that hallway, if he had been 1 floor away, if he had not been trained half a century ago by a man who taught him to hear when the numbers scream, it would have worked. By morning, the board would have panicked. By afternoon, they would have called the buyers. By the end of the week, the firm would have belonged to someone else, and Garrick Wexler would have stood in the wreckage wearing a face of grief, collecting his reward. "We need help," Roland said, finally, his voice steadier now, the businessman surfacing through the wreckage of the man. "Real help, the kind that holds up in a courtroom. I have you for the truth. I need someone who can turn the truth into a weapon." He picked up the phone again and dialed a number he knew by heart. The woman who answered, even at this ungodly hour, did not sound like she had been asleep. Her name was Adelaide Frost, and she was the kind of criminal attorney that powerful men kept on a private line and prayed they would never need. She specialized in financial fraud and corporate espionage, and Roland had once watched her dismantle an opposing witness so completely, so methodically, that the man had needed to be helped from the room. "Roland," she said, her voice clipped and clear as cut glass. "It's the middle of the night. Either someone died or someone's about to wish they had. Which is it?" "The second one," Roland said. "Adelaide, I need you here. The Meridian, now. And I need you to listen to me very carefully before you touch anything, before you say anything to anyone, because what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this building until it's airtight." He told her. Not all of it, but enough. And Sutton, listening, heard the lawyer's voice change on the other end of the line. Sharpen, come fully awake, the voice of a predator catching a scent on the wind. "Don't touch the servers," Adelaide said. "Don't change a single line. Don't log in and out more than you absolutely have to. From this moment, every keystroke is evidence. And I want the chain of custody so clean a federal judge could eat off it. Document everything. Timestamp everything. Lock it all down and put your hands in your pockets. I'll be there in 30 minutes. A pause. "And Roland, the man who found this, The one you're being cagey about. Keep him there. Whatever he is, whoever he is, I'm going to want to talk to him, and I'm going to want him exactly as he is right now before anyone has a chance to coach him or frighten him or change a word of what he saw. The line went dead. While they waited, the adrenaline that had carried Roland through the last hour began at last to ebb. He drifted back to the window and stood looking out at the city, and the exhaustion came down on him like a weight. And in the quiet, he asked the old man a question that had nothing to do with code. "Why?" Roland said softly, not turning around. "A mind like yours, why were you ever pushing a cart? How does the world let a man like you disappear?" And Sutton, in the warm, small glow of the desk lamp, finally told him. He told it plainly, the way an old man tells a thing he has carried so long it no longer cuts on the way out. He told of Cornelius, his father, the professor, who put a slide rule in a small boy's hands and taught him that numbers do not lie. He told of the university on the East Coast, the trading desk, the brilliant years when the world had no edges and every door stood open. He told of his wife gone too soon, taken by the long grief before the long road had even finished with them. And he told of Thomas, 7 years old. The word the doctor said in a small bright room with a box of tissues already placed thoughtfully within reach. The hospital chairs he slept in, the ones with the wooden arms that left marks on your face. The house he sold, the accounts he emptied, the future he laid down without a backward glance, because there was a boy who needed him, and a man cannot be a legend and a father in the same years. He told of how Thomas fought and how in the end it was not enough, and how the boy left behind a daughter, Della, a fierce small thing of 3, who would grow up to be a doctor as if to answer, with her whole life, the thing that had been done to her family. And how an old man had spent the last 20 years making certain she would have everything her father's illness had stolen from them all. And he told of trying once years ago to go back, of polished young people half his age who looked at the decade-wide gap in his history and could not imagine what could possibly fill it, of doors that would not open for an old man, however brilliant, who had been away too long in a world that moved too fast, of the slow, quiet understanding that the world had simply moved on without him, and that the card at least was honest. The card at least paid the bills and asked no questions and let him read at dawn. Roland listened with his back still half turned, and when Sutton finished, the executive's shoulders were shaking, and when he turned around, there were tears standing bright in his eyes. "I neglected my father," Roland said quietly. "Richard, while I was building this place all those years, I told myself I'd have time later. I told myself he understood, that he was proud that the empty chairs at the holidays were a price he was glad to pay for what I was becoming." He wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand. "He died while I was in a meeting. A meeting. I didn't make it to the hospital in time. I have carried that for 15 years. And tonight I find out the man I built it all, with the man I chose over my own father 100 times, was robbing me blind the entire time." A broken laugh. What was it all for Sutton? What in God's name was any of it for? Sutton looked at this powerful, ruined man, younger than himself by 20 years, and felt no anger toward him, no envy, none of the resentment a lesser man might have nursed across a decade of pushing a cart past doors like this one. Only a deep and weary tenderness, the tenderness of one father for another, of one man who had lost things for another, who was only now learning what loss was. "Your father loved you for the man you were trying to become," Sutton said gently, "not the one you already were. Men like our fathers, they see the whole arc, not just the part we're stuck in. He knew where you were going. He was proud of the going, even when it cost him the having you near." He paused. "And what Garrick did is Garrick's sin, not yours. You did not make him a thief. You trusted him, and trust is not a crime, whatever the world tries to teach us. Don't you pick up his shame and carry it home tonight. You've got enough of your own to carry. We all do. Leave his where it belongs." Roland looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between the two men in the dark. Something older than money, something Sutton had not felt in a very long time. The simple weight of being seen, and the stranger, deeper thing of being able to see someone else, to offer them comfort, to matter to another human being beyond the gleam he left on a glass table that no one ever noticed. Then the elevator chimed in the hall. Adelaide Frost arrived like weather. She swept into the office in a sharp, dark suit that showed no sign of the hour, her heels precise on the carpet, a leather case in one hand, and the very air of the room seemed to change around her. The soft grief of the night hardened instantly into something tactical and cold. She set the case on the glass desk, took one look at the screens, and began issuing orders before she had fully crossed the room. But she stopped when Roland introduced the old man. She turned and she looked at Sutton Harrow, gray-bearded in his cleaning apron, his hands still faintly smelling of the cleaning fluids of his trade, and Sutton braced himself for the flicker of dismissal he had learned to expect from people like her. The quick, downward glance, the polite nothing, the instant automatic sorting of a person into the category of things that did not matter. It did not come. Instead, Adelaide Frost extended her hand and shook his firmly, and looked him in the eye as one professional looks at another. "Mr. Ashford tells me you found in 3 seconds what a room full of his analysts missed in 4 hours," she said. "If that's true, then you're the most important person in this building tonight, and I'm going to need every one of those 3 seconds explained to me in language a jury can understand. Not approximations, not the gist. The real thing, slow enough that 12 ordinary people in a box can follow it. Can you do that?" "I can," Sutton said. "Then sit," she said. "Walk me through it. From the beginning." And for the next stretch of hours, as the black sky over Lake Michigan began at last to soften toward a pale and icy blue, the three of them built a wall that no man would ever climb over. Sutton translated the code into truth. Adelaide turned the truth into law. She had a way of asking questions that stripped a thing down to its load-bearing bones, that found the one point a defense would press on and pressed on it first harder until it either broke or held. She drafted affidavits in the old man's own careful words, never letting him say more than he knew, never letting him say less than he was sure of. She locked down the chain of evidence, time-stamped, witnessed, sealed. She built a dossier so complete and so precise that it left Garrick Wexler no room at all. No room to deny, no room to maneuver, no room to lie. And then just once near the coldest hour before dawn, Sutton's certainty broke. It came when Adelaide had him trace the routing protocol all the way back to its origin, to the very first ghost execution months ago, to the administrative credentials that had authorized it into being. She wanted the source. She wanted to put a name on the hand that had first reached into the machine. So Sutton pulled the thread. He followed it back and back through layers of obfuscation, through false trails and dead ends all the way home. And the credentials it pointed to were Roland's. For one terrible heartbeat, the room tilted. Sutton sat back, his old hands going still on the keyboard, and a cold suspicion crept up the back of his neck like a draft from an open door. He looked at Roland Ashford, this man who had begged him to stay, this man who had wept so convincingly in the dark, and a single poisonous thought formed in the deep of his mind. What if the weeping had been a performance? What if he, the invisible old man, the perfect anonymous witness with no name and no standing and no one to vouch for him, had been brought up here precisely so that he would put his honest face and his honest testimony to a fraud he did not fully understand? What if he was the pawn and not the rescuer? What if the trap that had been so carefully set tonight had been set for him? He half rose from the chair. 11 years of survival instinct. The whole hard-won wisdom of the gray coat screamed at him to get up, to walk out, to go back to his cart and his silence and never speak of this night again. And then he stopped. Because something was wrong with the credentials. Sutton made himself sit back down. He made himself look again, look the way his father had taught him, past the surface of the thing and into the bones of it. And he saw it. The hash was too clean. The authorization was too perfectly placed, sitting exactly where an investigator would look first, exactly where any half-competent forensic analyst would begin, and finding it would stop. It was signed in Roland's name with a tidiness, a deliberateness, a neatness that the rest of the sloppy, arrogant, corner-cutting parasite code never once showed. The thief who had been too lazy to cover his tracks everywhere else had been suddenly suspiciously meticulous in exactly this one place. It was a frame, a false trail laid down with care so that if anyone ever did look deep enough to find the theft, the trail would lead them not to Garrick Wexler, but straight to Roland Ashford. The founder would hang for his own murder. The board would discover that their leader had been looting his own firm, and in their horror and disgust, they would do exactly what Garrick wanted, exactly what the desperate always do. They would sell. Sutton sank back into the chair. He let out a slow breath, and with it the suspicion drained away, and he felt a flush of something close to shame for having harbored it, even for a heartbeat, against a grieving man. "It's a plant," he said quietly. "He dressed it in your name. If your board had found this, if anyone had found it, without looking deeper, they'd have been certain you robbed yourself. He built you a noose, Mr. Ashford, and he was careful for once in exactly the one place where carelessness would have saved you. He stitched your name into the rope. Roland stared at him, and then at the screen, and the last warmth drained out of his face, replaced by something hard and final, something that would never fully soften again. He thought of everything, Roland whispered. Almost everything, Adelaide said, not looking up from her notes, her pen moving fast and certain across the page. He thought of your board. He thought of your auditors. He thought of the regulators, the lawyers, the forensic accountants who'd come picking through the bones. He thought of every clever person who might ever look at this. She looked up then, and there was the ghost of a cold smile on her mouth. He did not think of the man with the cart. Why would he? No one ever does. Outside, far over the lake, the first true light was beginning to climb the underside of the clouds, gray and then pearl, and then the faintest breath of gold. And in the office, as the dossier closed at last complete, and sealed in lethal, Adelaide laid out the morning. Garrick Wexler arrived early every single day before the rest of the firm, a habit of 2 decades, the early bird performance of a man who wanted everyone to believe he worked harder than anyone else. When he came in, she and Roland would be waiting. They would confront him directly, calmly give him every chance to lie, let him dig the hole as deep as he was willing to dig it. And Sutton would be in the next room, the technical evidence loaded and ready, a final and unexpected weapon to be deployed the instant the man dared to deny what he had done. The trap was set, and this time it was the right man standing in it. Roland turned to the old man one last time as the gray dawn filled the windows. "Whatever happens this morning," he said quietly, "I give you my word, Sutton Harrow. Whatever else comes of this, you will never push a maintenance cart in this city again. Not because there's any shame in it. There isn't. But because the world owes you a debt, it's 11 years late in paying, and I intend to see it paid." Sutton said nothing. He looked out at the lightening sky over the sleeping city, the city that had not looked at him in over a decade, and felt for the first time in 11 years the slow, strange stirring of a thing he had thought was dead. Not ambition exactly. Something quieter and deeper than ambition. The simple wish to be useful again, to matter, to put the gift his father had given him to some good use before the end. Because down the long carpeted hall, the elevator was already beginning to hum. And somewhere far below in the brightening lobby, a man in an expensive coat was stepping through the doors with a cup of artisan coffee in his hand and a practiced look of sympathy fixed upon his face, riding up to console a partner he believed he had already destroyed, with no idea at all that a ghost was waiting for him at the top. Part 3. The footsteps came down the hall 45 minutes before the business day was meant to begin. They were confident footsteps. Expensive leather on thick carpet, unhurried, evenly spaced, the walk of a man who owned the ground he crossed and had never once in his life doubted that it would hold his weight. Sutton heard them from the small conference room where Adelaide had placed him, the technical evidence glowing on a laptop before him, and he felt his old heart begin to pound against his ribs, slow and heavy like a fist on a door. The heavy mahogany door of the corner office swung open. Garrick Wexler stepped through it, impeccably tailored, every line of him pressed and polished, a steaming cup of coffee in one manicured hand, the practiced, sympathetic smile of a grieving friend already arranged upon his face. He had come to console a broken partner. He had come to stand beside Roland in the ashes and murmur the right words, the soft and useful words, and begin gently, so gently, to steer the devastated man toward the only buyer left who could possibly save them. And the smile died on his face. It did not fade. It died all at once, the way a flame dies when a window is thrown open in a storm. Because the scene before him made no sense in any world he had prepared for, in any of the dozen futures he had surely rehearsed on the drive in. Roland was not broken. Roland sat rigid behind the great glass desk, calm and upright. His suit jacket buttoned his eyes clear and dry and cold. A woman in a sharp, dark suit stood beside him, zipping shut a leather briefcase with an unhurried final sort of motion, the motion of someone who has finished a job rather than someone beginning one. The monitors that should have been screaming red were dark and still, and spread across the desk were notebooks, printouts, technical pages covered edge to edge in a careful, precise hand. Garrick's eyes darted around the room, taking it all in. The calm, the lawyer, the silent screens, the evidence laid out like a feast, and Sutton, watching through the open door of the next room, saw the exact instant the predator understood that he had walked into a trap. It moved across his face like a shadow crossing a field, the animal knowing it before the mind could even shape the thought. "What?" Garrick said. The coffee cup trembled just slightly in his hand. He forced a laugh, weak and thin, a poor imitation of the easy laugh he must have used 10,000 times in this building. "What's going on here, Roland? What is this? Why is there a—" He gestured vaguely toward Adelaide. "A meeting before sunrise with a lawyer. I came as fast as I could. I heard about the losses. I've been sick about it all night." Roland did not raise his voice. He stood up slowly. He buttoned the one button of his jacket that was already buttoned, a small unconscious gesture, a man squaring himself for a thing he did not want to do, but would do regardless. And he looked at the man who had stood beside him at his father's grave, the man who had held his arm so he would not fall. And when he spoke, his voice carried a cold so deep and so controlled that it filled the entire room and pressed the temperature down by 10 degrees. "Sit down, Garrick." "Roland, I don't—" "Sit down." The two words cut through the air like a blade, and Garrick Wexler, founding partner, managing titan, master of the universe, the most persuasive man Roland Ashford had ever known, slowly set his coffee on a side table with a hand that was no longer entirely steady and lowered himself into the chair like a man whose legs had stopped obeying him. Roland began to speak. He told it plainly, without drama, which made it worse. How he had stayed late alone to think the way Garrick had so helpfully encouraged him to do. How he had watched the numbers begin to bleed slow at first, and then all at once 20 years of his life vaporizing on the screen in front of him. How he had wept alone in the dark, certain the market had turned against everything he loved, and there was nothing in the world he could do about it. He said it without shame, the weeping said it as a plain fact, and Garrick's face arranged itself into a mask of sorrow. "Roland, I'm so sorry. I came as soon as I—" Roland raised a single hand and Garrick fell silent. And then Roland said, "Someone walked into this office. Someone I had never once truly looked at in 11 years of riding the same elevators, walking the same halls. Someone you never looked at either. And in 3 seconds, with no dashboard, no team, no warning, he saw the thing you spent months making sure no one would ever see." He turned toward the open door of the conference room. "Mr. Harrow," he said, "would you come in here, please?" And Sutton Harrow stood up from the laptop and walked out of the small room and into the corner office, gray-bearded and weathered, still in the dark trousers and worn shirt of the night crew, because there had been no time and no reason to change, and because he understood now the clothes were exactly the point. He came to stand quietly beside the monitors, his back straight, his hands easy at his sides, and he looked at Garrick Wexler with calm old eyes that did not waver and did not blink. Garrick stared at him, and Sutton watched the absurdity of it crash over the man's face, the sheer vertiginous impossibility that he, Garrick Wexler, with his 20 years and his architecture and his beautiful, intricate, perfect plan, was being undone. Not by a rival, not by a federal investigator, not by some brilliant young analyst with a famous degree. By the cleaning man, by the ghost who emptied the trash, by a thing he had walked past 1,000 times and never once bothered to see. "This is Sutton Harrow," Roland said. "He studied algorithmic anomaly detection at a university that wouldn't have returned your calls, Garrick. He worked trading desks when you were still in school. He has forgotten more about the bones of a system than you ever learned. And last night, while you sat in your warm house waiting for the news that I'd broken, he diagnosed your sabotage in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee." Garrick's eyes snapped back to Roland. The mask was slipping now fast, the sympathy curdling into something cornered and ugly and afraid. "This is insane," he said, and his voice had climbed half an octave. "You're going to take the word of a janitor." Roland, listen to yourself. Listen to how this sounds. The man cleans floors. He cannot possibly understand our proprietary code, our architecture, the most sophisticated system in this entire industry. He's confused you. He's seen some numbers he doesn't— "Every 43rd operation," Sutton said quietly. The room went still. Sutton did not raise his voice. He had never been a man who needed to. He had learned long ago that the quietest voice in a room, if it has something true to say, is the one everyone strains to hear. "Every 43rd operation broke from the engine's own logic," he said. Disguised behind a false identification hash, dressed up as a legitimate internal transfer, skimming a fraction of capital each time, and routing it out through a hidden external protocol to an account I expect Ms. Frost will have a name for before lunch. The disguise was careful, written deliberately to imitate Mr. Ashford's own style so that anyone who found it would blame the man it was stealing from. But the logic underneath the disguise was sloppy, lazy, written by a man who had grown too proud to bother covering his tracks, because in 20 years no one had ever once looked deep enough to make him pay for his arrogance. Garrick stared at him, his face going gray, the color leaving it in a slow tide. "And then you tried to frame him for it," Sutton went on, his tone almost gentle, almost sorrowful, nodding once toward Roland. "You dressed the original authorization in his name. Tidy, too tidy, sitting right where an investigator would look first and finding it stop looking, so that if anyone ever did find the wound, they would blame the man who was bleeding from it." Sutton paused, and his old eyes held the younger man's without any anger in them at all, only a deep and patient certainty. "That was the part that gave you away, son. That was your one mistake. A guilty man hides his tracks everywhere. Only a man building a frame leaves a trail that clean. You were sloppy where it didn't matter, imperfect where it did, and a careful eye reads that difference like a signature." Garrick's hand went to his silk tie, tugging at it as though it had suddenly grown too tight. His breathing had gone shallow and fast. "Roland," he tried, turning back to his partner, his voice cracking now, the polish gone, the persuasion failing for perhaps the first time in his life. "Roland, please, you've known me for 20 years. 20 years. You can't possibly believe a stranger over." Adelaide Frost turned her laptop around to face him. She did it without a word. She simply rotated the screen on its smooth hinge and let the man look at what was on it, in the office filled with a silence so complete that Sutton could hear the wind moving against the glass 32 floors up. On the screen was a chain of emails, encrypted once, legally extracted hours ago under Adelaide's careful and meticulous hand, every step documented, every seal intact. And in them, laid out in Garrick Wexler's own unmistakable words, were his negotiations with the Overseas Investment Group, the exact percentage he would receive once the deal closed. The timeline. The plan stated plainly to cripple Ashford Vane Capital in a single catastrophic night, to panic the board into the buyout, to hand the firm he had built with his own two hands to the men who would strip it for parts and pay him handsomely for the carcass. Garrick stared at his own treason glowing on the screen in his own words. His hand worked at his tie. His mouth opened and closed and opened again, and no sound came out. And the walls of the elite, untouchable, gilded world he had lived in his entire adult life came down around him, silent and total, like snow sliding off a roof. "There's a notary waiting in the lobby," Adelaide said, her voice as calm and even and final as a closing door. "Mr. Ashford has already authorized me to file federal charges, wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, securities violations I could list for 10 minutes. The kind of charges that end with a man your age in a federal facility for what would functionally be the rest of his life." She let that sit in the room, let it find its full weight. Or, she said, "You sign a full confession this morning in this room before you leave it. You return every dollar you've taken. You surrender your equity, your partnership, your name on the door, all of it, completely and permanently. You walk away from this firm and this industry forever. And Mr. Ashford, against my strong professional advice, is willing to handle the separation privately. No public trial, no press, no prison, just the quiet, total, irreversible end of everything you have ever been." She folded her hands on the desk. "2 doors, Mr. Wexler. You have a few moments to choose one of them." Garrick Wexler stared at the thick carpet between his expensive shoes for a very long time, and Sutton watched the fight drain out of him. He watched the arrogance go first, and then the polish, and then the 20 years of expensive certainty, all of it simply leaking away through some invisible wound, until what was left in the deep leather chair was nothing but the small and pitiful shape of a greedy man who had gambled everything he had and everything he was and lost it all in the space of a single night. When Garrick finally spoke, his voice was a broken, whining whisper, stripped of every ounce of the charm that had carried him through his whole life. "It started small," he said, not looking up, speaking to the carpet. "A personal debt, something I was certain I could cover that no one would ever need to know about. And then the hole got deeper. It always gets deeper. You tell yourself you'll climb out, you'll make it back just one more quarter, just one more move, and the hole only ever gets deeper. And then the buyers, they found me. Somehow they always know where to find a drowning man, and they offered me a way out. An easy way. All I had to do was... He stopped. His voice failed entirely. All you had to do, Roland said quietly, was burn down the man who held your arm at his father's grave. Garrick flinched as though he had been struck across the face. I sat at your table, Roland said. His voice did not rise, but something terrible and grieving moved beneath it, slow and deep, like a current under ice. Sunday dinners, birthdays. You held my children when they were small. You ate at my table in my home with my family, all while you were robbing me blind and planning to hand my life's work to strangers. My father loved you, Garrick. He used to tell me I was lucky that some men go their whole lives and never find a partner they can trust like a brother. A long pause, and when Roland spoke again, his voice was barely more than breath. He died believing that about you. Garrick Wexler buried his face in his hands and began to weep. It was not a noble grief. It was not the weeping Sutton had heard in this very room only hours before the helpless sob of a man watching everything he loved destroyed by forces beyond his control. This was the small, ugly, self-pitying weeping of a man crying only for himself, for the comfort he had lost, for the consequences that had finally, after 20 patient years, arrived at his door. And Sutton, who had heard real weeping and false weeping both, and who had learned in a long life how to tell them apart, found that he could not watch it. He turned his gaze gently to the window, to the city, waking up far below to the honest gray light of an ordinary morning. There was no triumph in him. There never was in the end in moments like this. Only the sad, tired spectacle of a man who had thrown away something precious and irreplaceable, and was only now far too late in the wreckage of his own choosing, beginning to understand its worth. Adelaide rose. The holding room, she said briskly but not unkindly to Garrick. Your own counsel can meet you there. No phone, no terminal, no contact with anyone until the surrender documents are prepared and signed. And she guided the broken man unresisting now, all the fight gone out of him, out of the office, and through the far door which clicked shut behind them with a small and final sound like the last period at the end of a very long sentence. And then the office was quiet. The toxic thing was gone from it, carried out the door, and the room felt suddenly larger, lighter, cleaner, as though a window had been opened somewhere to let the night air out. Roland Ashford sank back into his great leather chair and let out a long breath that seemed to carry 20 years on it. He looked across the room at the old man standing by the dark monitors, and his eyes were wet and full, and entirely unable to find words large enough for the thing he needed to say. You saved my legacy, Roland said at last, his voice rough and low. My company, my name, the work of my whole adult life. But that isn't even... He pressed a hand flat against his own chest over his heart, as if to hold something in. You saved my sense of who I am. Because if he'd gotten away with it, if I'd lost it all in the night and never known why, I'd have spent the rest of my life believing I simply wasn't good enough. That I'd failed. You didn't just save my firm, Sutton. You saved the truth. And I don't have the words to thank a man for that. I don't think the words exist. Before Sutton could deflect it, before he could murmur that he had only done the thing his father had taught him to do at a kitchen table 70 years ago, a phone began to buzz on the corner of the great glass desk. It was his own. The small, old scratch phone he had set down there hours ago and entirely forgotten in the long work of the night. The screen lit up with a single name. Della. Sutton's heart lurched. It was well past dawn now. He should have been home hours ago, should have been there when she woke the way he always was, with the kettle on and the radio low. He answered, and his granddaughter's voice came through the speaker fast and frightened, tumbling over itself, demanding to know where he was, why he hadn't come home, why his coat was still on its hook and his uniform still hanging in the closet when it should have been long gone. Della, he said gently, turning slightly away, lowering his voice. Della, sweetheart, I'm all right. I promise you I'm all right. Something happened at the building last night. Something I never expected. I'll explain all of it when... But Della Harrow had the sharp, relentless, well-trained mind of a young woman 3 months away from being a physician, a mind that had learned to hear the things people did not say, and she heard instantly the thing her grandfather could not hide, the exhaustion in his voice, the strange, thick weight under the words. and she leapt the way the loving and the frightened always leap to the only conclusion that made any sense to her in the world as she understood it. That they had done something to him. That these hard, rich people in their cold glass tower had fired him or shamed him or worked an old man past his breaking and cast him out into the snow. "I'm coming," she said, and there was no arguing with the steel in it. "I'm already on the train. Don't tell me not to." "What floor?" "Della." "What floor, Grandpa?" And before he could find a way to soften it, before he could begin to prepare her for the thing she was about to walk into, he heard himself give her the number, and the line went dead in his hand. Sutton lowered the phone slowly. Roland was watching him, and there was a soft, knowing warmth in the executive's tired and tear-marked face. "Let her come," he said quietly. "I would very much like to meet the young woman who inspired a man to lay down a life like the one you laid down." He almost smiled, and there was something wistful in it, something reaching back toward his own lost chances. Let her see with her own eyes exactly who her grandfather really is. The high-speed elevator carried Della Harrow up through the heart of the Meridian Tower, and her heart pounded out a furious protective rhythm the whole long way up. She was 24, dressed in her practical university clothes, a heavy medical textbook still weighing down the bag on her shoulder from a night of studying the shadows of too little sleep still smudged under her eyes. She had come to defend her grandfather. She had come ready for a fight. She had built a picture in her mind on the train of a frightened old man being scolded by hard people in expensive suits, and she had come to put herself between him and all of them, the way he had spent her whole life putting himself between her and the world. Down in the lobby, the old porter Kai had stopped her, had looked her dead in the eye with a strange and steady kindness, and told her something she had not understood. He had told her that her grandfather carried more dignity in his pinky finger than all the billionaires in the building put together. She had nodded confused and hurried to the elevator, and now she turned the words over and over as the floors slid past 28, 29, 30. The doors opened on the 32nd floor. She stepped out onto thick, soft carpet into a world of glass and pale gray morning light and quiet, enormous wealth. The kind of place her grandfather had always described to her on the rare nights she asked as terribly boring a place where nothing ever happened and no one was ever interesting. A small, loving lie she would understand in a moment told 1,000 times over the years to keep her from ever glimpsing the size and the shape of what he had given up for her. She walked the long corridor toward the open mahogany door at the far end, bracing herself with every step for the sight she had built in her mind. The mop, the bucket, the bent old man being made small in a room full of people who would never see his worth. She reached the door, and she stopped, because the man at the center of that grand and gleaming office was not holding a mop. Her grandfather sat in a deep leather chair, perfectly at ease, perfectly at home, his gray beard catching the soft morning light from the windows, speaking as an equal, as more than an equal, to a powerful man in a tailored suit who was leaning toward him, listening, hanging on his every quiet word. There was no cart anywhere in the room. There was no apron, no bucket, no trace of the work she had always believed was the whole of his world. He was surrounded instead by financial documents and legal pads and dark, silent monitors, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, some calm and certain and bone-deep authority that Della had never once seen in all her 24 years of loving him. And yet somehow impossibly she knew it. She recognized it the way you recognize a melody you have never heard before, but feel the moment it begins that you have somehow always known. Sutton looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, and his weathered old face broke open into a smile so full, so tearful, so utterly without disguise, that Della felt her own throat close tight around a sound she could not make. He rose from the chair and crossed the room to her and pulled his granddaughter into his arms and held her there in the gray morning light as though she were the only solid and true thing in all the world. "Grandpa," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice trembling. "What is this? Who are these people? What in the world is happening?" Roland Ashford stepped forward with great and careful gentleness. He extended his hand to the young woman, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with a sincerity that no amount of money could have bought. "Miss Harrow," he said, "your grandfather saved my company last night. He saved 20 years of my life and the livelihoods of everyone who works for me, and a great deal of money besides. But I want you to understand that is not the important part." He looked at Sutton and then back at her, and his eyes were shining. "The important part is that he saved my soul. He reminded me what a man is actually worth, which has nothing to do with anything that hangs on these walls. And I think it is long past time that you knew exactly who he is." Sutton guided his bewildered granddaughter to a chair across from the great glass desk, and Roland, with quiet grace, withdrew toward the windows and turned his back to give them their privacy, pretending a sudden deep interest in the waking city below. And Sutton Harrow took his granddaughter's hands in his own, old, worn, careful hands, and drew a long, long breath, and at last, after a lifetime of silence, he began to unravel the story he had kept folded away from her the whole of her life. He told her about her father first, Thomas, the little boy with the quick mind and the easy laugh, the boy who had sat at a kitchen table asking why and why and why again, until the questions ran out past the edge of what anyone knew. He told her about her great-grandfather Cornelius, the stern and brilliant professor who had taught a small boy to read equations the way other men read poetry, who smelled of chalk and pipe tobacco, and who believed above all else that numbers were the one language on earth that could not lie. And then gently he told her the truth. The prestigious university on the East Coast, the career that had been opening before him like a sunrise, the trading desks, the brilliant years, and then the terrible days of her own father's illness, when she had been too small to remember any of it. The long road, the medical bankruptcy, the house sold, the accounts emptied, the future laid down without a single moment's hesitation. All of it, every piece of it, so that a sick little boy could have his father's hand to hold in the long dark of the hospital nights. Della listened in a stunned and growing silence, the tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks as all the empty spaces in their whole shared history filled themselves in at last, one after another, like rooms in a house she had lived in all her life and never known were there. She understood it now. All of it. The second-hand coats he had never complained about. The careful budgets. The way he came home smelling of disinfectant at dawn and never once spoke of being tired. And most of all, the fierce, relentless, unwavering way he had always pushed her toward her studies, toward science, toward medicine, toward learning to heal the very kind of wound that had taken her father from them both. She understood the size of the thing he had buried, and the reason he had buried it, and the vast and quiet ocean of love that lay at the bottom of it all. When he finished, Della slid down out of her chair and knelt on the thick carpet at his feet, and wrapped her arms tight around him, and wept openly and apologized over and over for never knowing, for never asking for all the buried dreams he had hidden so completely that she had never even known there was a grave. Sutton stroked her hair the way he had when she was small and frightened in the night, and his own tears fell freely now into the gray morning light, and he was not ashamed of them. "I don't regret it," he whispered fiercely against the top of her head. "Not one single second of it, Della. Do you hear me? Not one. Watching you walk into a hospital one day to heal people, to give some other frightened family the thing no one could give us, that is a greater return than any market on this earth could ever pay me. You were always the better investment, sweetheart. You always were. You always will be. There was never even a choice to make." By the window, Roland Ashford wiped his own eyes with the back of his hand, moved beyond speaking by the raw and undeniable power of the bond between them, and he wished with a sudden and aching and useless clarity that he had been given a fraction of that grace, a fraction of that courage, while his own father was still alive on the earth to receive it. When the worst of the legal mourning was finally done, when Garrick Wexler had signed away his entire existence in the holding room, with a trembling hand, page after page after page, Roland sent Sutton and Della down to the lobby cafe to sit and breathe and let the enormity of the morning settle around them. The young barista behind the counter refused with a bright and cheerful smile to take their money, explaining that Mr. Ashford himself had called down to say their tab was covered for the entire day, and that they were to be treated, in his exact words, like visiting royalty. They sat together by the wide front window, an old man and his granddaughter, watching the Chicago morning rush flow past on the street below, the hurrying crowds, the steam rising from the grates, 2 warm cups going slowly cold between them, and neither of them caring. And the silence that sat between them now was no longer the old heavy silence of secrets kept and burdens hidden. It was a new thing entirely. It was light and it was vast, and it was filled to the brim with the deep and unfamiliar peace of 2 people who had survived the very worst the world could do to a family, and had come through it whole, and could at last finally see each other clear and entire. Della reached across the small table and took his hand in both of hers. "Promise me," she said, and her eyes were shining with a fierce and shaking pride. "Promise me right now that you will never hide that mind behind a cart again, that you'll never disappear again. Promise me you'll take back every inch of the space you should have had all along." And Sutton Harrow, 71 years old, looked across the table at his granddaughter, his son's daughter, the whole of his future, and the reason for his whole past, and felt the dormant, buried, long-sleeping thing in his chest finally and fully come awake. He nodded slowly. "I promise," he said. Upstairs even then, even as they sat with their cooling coffee, Roland was already at work on the rest of it. He drafted the position himself before noon, a real one. Not charity, not a favor, but a job built around the old man, and nothing else, a job the firm had needed for 20 years and never known it. Director of Anomaly Detection and Systemic Risk. Total authority over the quantitative team. A direct line reporting to no one but Roland himself. The full and unconditional mandate to tear down the firm's old safeguards and rebuild them from the ground up with his own hands and his own hard-won wisdom, so that a betrayal of this kind, a wound like this one, could never ever happen to anyone in this building again. And a salary written plainly in clean black numbers that rivaled the most senior risk officers on Wall Street. When Sutton returned to the 32nd floor that afternoon, Roland slid a thick, elegant leather folder across the low table between them, and Sutton opened it and looked down at a contract bearing his own name, his real name typed in clean black letters at the top of the page. And behind the typed words, as clear as if the man were sitting across from him, he saw the proud and smiling face of his father Cornelius at an old and scarred kitchen table long ago in the lamplight, telling a small and serious boy that the numbers never lie, and that one day, no matter how long it took, the world would be ready for his mine. With Della's hand tight and warm and his Sutton Harrow accepted. A journalist came in the days that followed, a careful and deeply ethical man named Mercer Quill, a writer known throughout the city for valuing human truth over cheap and easy scandal. And when his long investigation finally ran, it did not center, as a lesser story would have, on the greedy partner in his spectacular betrayal at all. It centered on the old man, on the decades of quiet sacrifice, on the brilliance buried for 11 years under a cleaning apron and a gray coat of silence. On the night a ghost stepped out of the shadows of a corporate tower and spoke, and in speaking saved an empire he owed nothing to. The piece made Sutton Harrow, against every instinct of his careful and private life, an inspiration to scholars and to working fathers and to every overlooked and underestimated person who had ever pushed a cart past a door they were never allowed to open. Garrick Wexler vanished into a smaller and humbler life. His fortune surrendered, his name quietly erased from the steel beside the elevators. Roland Ashford learned at last, and at terrible cost, that integrity weighs more than wealth, and he began slowly, deliberately, to live as though he truly believed it to be home for dinners, to call the people he loved while they could still answer. And old Kay, the porter, before he retired that spring after a lifetime at the door, left a small worn notebook on Sutton's new desk, in which years before any of this, in a careful hand, he had written a single line, "There goes a great man pushing a cart." Weeks later, in a new and modest home with light pouring through every window, Della told her grandfather the last piece of news, the piece she had been saving. Roland's charitable foundation had established a scholarship, and it would bear his name. The Sutton Harrow Grant for Exceptional Resilience, set aside for the children of maintenance workers and service workers, the night crews and the porters, and the invisible people who carry the whole weight of the world on their backs through the dark and are almost never once seen carrying it. And Della, holding her grandfather's hand in the bright kitchen of their new home, made him a promise of her own to set beside the one he had made her in the cafe. She would finish. She would become a doctor. She would heal people the way her father had once needed healing, the way her grandfather had given up an entire brilliant life to make possible. She would carry the whole of it forward, the sacrifice and the love and the long, quiet courage, into a future Thomas had never gotten to see. Sutton Harrow stood at the window of his new home in the gold of the late afternoon and looked out at the great city that had not truly looked at him in over a decade. And he understood at last, fully and finally, the deepest truth his father had ever tried to teach him at a kitchen table 70 years before. A man is not measured by his title or his wealth or the cart he pushes through the long dark of the night. He is measured by what he is willing to lay down for the people he loves, and by whether, when the numbers finally scream, and everyone else in the room has gone deaf to the sound of them, he can still find the courage to stand up out of the shadows and speak. He had laid down everything, and when the moment came after all the silent years he had spoken, and the truth in the end had been more than enough.